Well, thank you everybody for your patience while we got through a little technical issue. This is the last of the series in the LSA speaker series, and we'll resume again in the fall, as always. Very happy tonight to, I'm Tom Tillman, Chair of the London Society of Architects, and for those that haven't been here before, we welcome you. What a kind of a tough night to get out and get here, and we appreciate everybody's attendance. And I was about to say, I'm very happy to have Chris Pommer here from Plant Architecture, or Plant Architect Inc., if I have to be official, and that's for the record. Plant is fine, as it turns out. Chris and I have been collaborating the last few months on a project at Western, and very appreciative of the team that Western has sent to see tonight's talk. Chris is a founding member of Plant Architect from 1995. He was a student at the University of Waterloo, and I know a little bit about Plant Architect, but you're going to learn a lot about what Plant Architect does, what they do, because it's not just architecture. And I think I saw Art Learman here. It's about landscape architecture, it's about urban architecture, but it's about graphic design, it's about signage. They really do a full integration of design and how it affects the built environment. And from that point of view, it's a little bit different than the usual stuff that, and that's probably not fair to say, the usual stuff that we see. It's different, and I think you'll be quite interested in what Chris has to say. Chris has been involved in a number of projects which I'm sure you're going to be talking about, but most recently Nathan Philips Square, that redevelopment, he was the lead architect on with Perkins Will, and I say most recently, but it was a 10-year project, so there was a lot of thought and planning that went into it before that project came to fruition. I don't know if people have been to it since the redevelopment, but it is quite a change, and it has made quite a difference in terms of the use of the place. And so it's that kind of deep, intense thinking that goes into their projects that are they're not always just run by time. They're done in a way that there's a lot of thought that goes into it. I'm not sure how you actually make a living doing this, but at any rate, there's no comment. Chris is from Winnipeg, and I think you're the first lecturer we've had from Winnipeg, so welcome Manitoba to our series. As part of Chris's professional life, he also does participate in this sort of thing in terms of giving lectures. He has lectured at and works with the University of Toronto School of Architecture, as well as the School of Architecture at Waterloo, also at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. So he's well gifted, and I think he'll be very happy in terms of you've made the effort to get out here tonight. It'll be well worthwhile. That's enough. He's getting a little bothered by that. So Chris, welcome to the microphone.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this delightful night. Thanks, Tom. Thanks to Mauricio and everyone at the LSA for inviting me out here tonight. I would like to start tonight telling you a little about who we are and what we've been up to. As Tom mentioned, my partners and I went to school at Waterloo way back in the 80s. Started Plant in the 90s. And have been working on a big range of things ever since. When we were young. So this is my partners, Lisa Rappaport and Mary Tremaine, and I, back on the roof of our old studio, back in the early days. As I said, we went to Waterloo in the 80s, and all three of us had developed over the course of our schooling an interest in the landscape. So we were trained as architects, but we all had an interest in the landscape, coming from it from different perspectives. In my case, it was an obsession with Earth scale art, for those who dig that sort of thing. So we began thinking about it and exploring it in the 80s, and then we brought that to our practice when we started our own studio. We've grown over the years. We're pushing 20 now. So this is everyone who's working in the studio right now. As you see, we all see eye to eye. But this is actually another view of the studio. This is at last year's year-end holiday party, which is a dinner for everyone in the studio that's cooked by the partners. And it takes place on a long table in our house, in our living room. We clear everything out and everyone sits down, and it's fantastic. And I think, what you're seeing here is, I think the theme of tonight's talk, which is conversation, right? Conversation is fundamental to the way we work. I think those who know us will not have any doubt that talking is something that we enjoy doing. And so it's one of the things that's at the core of what we do. So I'm going to show you some work, a number of projects, and I want to talk about both projects and how we work. This is a kind of overview of an arc of the work of the practice. So, the way that fundamental to the way we work is the process, whatever that might be. It's different for everyone, but for us, the process and where that can lead you. Research is critical to our work. Often a deep dive at the beginning of a project into arcana involved in wherever you're going to be working opens up design conversations further down the line in the project. Talking is central, and that's why it's in the middle of the slide. And it's one of the reasons we have an open studio. It's a couple of rooms now as we've gotten bigger, but it's basically a big open space like a traditional architecture school studio. And one of the big reasons for that is you just can't beat the chance jumping into a conversation that you're having by someone who has an insight into the project that they're not even working on, but they've heard something, and that just kind of keeps the ball rolling. Drawing, here also for us includes writing. And this is the reference to mid-'80s post-structuralist theory, but we see the written word as being crucial both to the communication of our work, to the communication of our ideas, but it's also a potential part of projects. And you'll see that typographic meme in many of the projects I'm going to show you tonight. And then lastly, making things. Not just through the work of contractors and builders and others, fabricators, but also making things ourselves. We like to try and always have something on the go where we're actually making it, because you can learn lots through your hands, just the way you can with book learning. So this talk follows a structure that is a kind of inversion of something that's maybe familiar to some of you. This is also a nod to a past part of my life. I spent a few years working with Bruce Mao Design in the late 90s, working on book design and identity and typography and exhibition design, things like that. And that's something, I ended up there partly through earlier obsessions, and those obsessions have kind of continued through in our work, and you'll see that. So, the first project I'm going to show you is Sweet Farm. This is a project, talk about long projects, this is a project that was started in 1994 and technically speaking is still going. And you'll understand the reasons why shortly. This is one of those projects we were incredibly lucky to have been found by our clients. It started as a pretty vague project description on the part of our clients with not much scope. It allowed us to explore a set of ideas about the conversation between architecture and landscape. And that's something that has kind of flowed through the rest of our work. And that theme, it runs through the work of the studio, and it informs, again, not only the form, but also the process. So the project is in the Eastern Townships. It's essentially a private park. It's a private property, although there are no fences. So it's, as with much of the Canadian landscape, if you walk onto it, you're welcome. It's 85 acres that were assembled by our clients over many years as as land became available adjacent to their land. So they had a house, an existing country house up here, with a pond and a kind of, classic Eastern Townships manicured, picturesque landscape around the house. And then they slowly bought up land, in sort of that shape. It's a very heterogeneous site. There's very mature second growth woods, meadows, a bog, a gorge, a dell, a slough, and then of course the landscape of the original house. They used the site. They walked and cross-country skied through the site using the existing deer runs as trails. But they had a sense that, as they said, we're not sure we're getting everything we can out of our property, whatever that means. Oh, and they wanted a way to get down to the gorge that's at the bottom of the site. It has a very steep hill, and there's a beautiful rushing stream down there. So that was it. And as we spent time on the site, just walking around, trying to understand what was going on there and trying to understand that landscape, we began to understand that, in fact, that was the project. The project was about understanding the landscape, or the landscapes. So we proposed a set of landscape and architectural interventions that were about looking at each of the landscape types and drawing on them to generate and influence the form of those interventions. One of the guiding principles was that the site was closed from the beginning of our project, and that we would find a use for everything that was there. We would also build as much as we could from materials that were harvested from the site at the pace of the harvesting from the site. So there was woodlot management going on and things like that. And we were going to use that, and we would trade for anything that we couldn't harvest, like fasteners. So they would mill wood, sell it to the local lumberyard, and then trade it for steel and bolts and things like that. And that pace that was set by the natural process of the site also allowed for reflection on the design as the project went forward, and as we waited for wood to cure. So fundamentally, here again you see there's the original. That's the house and the original landscape. You've got a kind of mature second growth hemlock forest in here, with a kind of marshy area that runs through the middle of it. A clearing in the woods here with, you'll see that shortly. There's the gorge down at the bottom. There's a big meadow that kind of cascades down the hill with a view from the top that looks toward, it's a classic Eastern Townships view with, the church on the hill on the other side of the valley, and the trees and the cows and arranged in groups of three. There was there was an old mink farm that had been down here, and then the neighbors have orchards and things going on. This is a kind of iconic image of the project for me. It was taken by a Toronto photographer named Stephen Evans, who some of you may know for his architectural work. He was very involved in this project. He documented it all, and we learned a lot from that, not just from me carting his 8x10 camera through the woods on my back on skis, but also from the importance of having really, really exquisite images of your work. It makes it very easy to get it published. Something that should be obvious, but not everyone knows that. But this image it's down in the creek at the bottom of the gorge, and you've got sort of flotsam. There are bits of garbage wood from other properties that have come downstream. You've got apples from the orchard. You've got twigs and branches and things floating there, and there's traces of nature. There's traces of human occupation, and there's garbage, but it's all kind of beautiful, right? And that's something that that we wanted to embrace. So these are just some views of the landscape that was there. these incredible sort of cathedral-like spaces with these giant hemlock trees. And, it was the kind of place that's really inspiring. So, sort of walking around the site from the house, the first element is a woodshed. It's the most refined of all of the pieces. It's got, dressed lumber and stuff like that, and it acts as a kind of threshold to the forest. It bridges between that well-manicured, picturesque landscape around the house and the wilderness of the rest of the site. And it sits, at the edge of the forest, so the house is kind of over here. And it's a gateway. It's got in addition to being a woodshed, it's got a bench here so that you can, lace up your cross-country ski boots. It's got a little, workspace here so you can wax your skis before you head out. And it just kind of acts as a kind of transition between the two landscapes. And then it also serves as a kind of a temporal measurement of the forest. As it fills up over the summer, as wood is taken down and harvested for firewood, and then it kind of opens up as the wood is used over the course of the winter. The next piece of landscape is the slough, which is basically a small marshy area at the top of the forest, and really this is a place that it was previously inaccessible, but had kind of beautiful light. I mean, you can see that kind of fairy tale landscape. And the intervention here was basically building a path out of vertically stacked logs that allowed you to get out to that space without having to wear hip waders, and a bench to just sit and enjoy the light and enjoy the end of the day before the bugs come out. It also provides, coming out the other side of it, it also provides a path to that clearing in the woods that I was talking about, and I'll show you that in a bit. And there's a view looking back from the top of the slough. Further into the woods is another kind of marshy area that's kind of downhill from that little slough that opens up into the forest and brings light into the heart of those deep woods. We constructed a path across the marsh that had two characters. This one that kind of mimics stepping from log to log as you try and cross a body of marshy water. And another one that's kind of like a straight run, like running along the length of a fallen tree to get across a gap. We also made sure it was skiable in the winter, so if you're intrepid, you can actually ski across that at full speed. The spacing's just right. And then in the middle of the two paths was a small dock or porch with two benches that faced each other. And the amazing thing about this piece of landscape is that because there was this kind of marshy area and that clearing, there were tons of bugs in there. And what that meant was, because of the opening, it meant the birds could get in there and get to the bugs. So you would sit here in the middle of the afternoon and there were hundreds of birds swooping around, gorging themselves on this kind of feast in the woods, which is super distinct from the hemlock forest, where basically it's just silent, right? So you have these kind of dramatically different landscape types right next to each other. And yeah, you could just sort of hang out in the middle of the marsh and enjoy it. Moving further south towards the edge of the gorge, the path sort of runs along the top of the gorge, and what we did is we made another kind of temporal recording device, the woven walls. As part of the forest management, small branches and brush and stuff was cleared every year, and previously it had always been burned, mostly. So what we asked was that the larger branches would get collected at either end of a new series of posts and a few trees that were kind of worked around. And then every time someone walked by, they would grab something off the pile and weave it into the fence. And so over time, it makes a screen between that kind of open space of the forest that you feel like you're part of. It screens you and kind of pushed you into the space of the gorge, right? So it's sort of just a little change, but enough to make you see the space differently. And there's a detailed view of it. And then as you walk along the edge, we built a belvedere that kind of slides off the edge of the gorge at the same level as the path. The idea was to make a place that would take you out into the trees and allow you to experience the gorge from a different kind of perspective. It was built out of alternating maple and hemlock planks that were milled on site, and it was woven around the existing trees that were there. And we tried to make it as open as possible. Please, I hope there are no code inspectors here. But we wanted to heighten that sense of being out there in the space of the trees. And given the easy path to the edge, the view from the end was surprising to some. You'd get to the end, especially if you're on skis, it was great. Because by the end of it, you're about 30 feet up in the air. And the whole thing was redesigned quite a few times over the course of construction, because as the contractors are out there trying to dig foundation holes, they kept finding tree roots and glacial erratics and all sorts of other stuff, and we had to keep moving things around to allow it to actually get built, which is also why there's only one foundation at the bottom, because originally it had parallel things. And so, we just sat out there, and I was on the phone with the engineer, and we redesigned the whole thing on the fly. And there's a kind of side view of it. So you can see the drop at the end. And then the rule that I talked about of closing the site, it originally came from our first walkabout with the clients, who mentioned that they were going to take the 1,000 or so mink cages that had been left there by the mink farm and tossed into the woods, and get someone to pull them out of the woods and take them to the dump. We realized there was potential in those cages. So we designed an outdoor dining room out of them that actually was built on a Labor Day weekend by all of our clients and their friends. It was a kind of Tom Sawyer day. And it sits at the top of that meadow that I was talking about with the beautiful view. We planted it, so it's basically a little room, an enclosure with a room and a bench at the top of the view. We planted native climbing vines around the bases so that over time it would sort of get engulfed in green. And then we turned a whole bunch of the cages sideways so that birds could start nesting inside, because the mink cages are basically closed on all sides and then have a hole on the top where you would take the snarling mink and put it in its cage. So the birds could kind of start to occupy it. And that's the view, there's that bench that's kind of looking back down the valley. And then lastly, there are some things that just needed to be kept as simple as humanly possible. So all we did here is we built a bench out of rough cut logs under this magnificent specimen birch that had grown up in the middle of a lightning strike clearing in the woods. And this was a huge lesson for us. It was basically this lesson that I've kind of been talking about on the project that we're working on with Tom. Making places to sit is really, really important, and it's a really simple thing, and we don't do enough of it. And it allows people to sit and pause and actually understand the landscape that they're in, whether that's an urban landscape or a natural one. So, taking it down a notch in scale, something I didn't ever think I'd say, Nathan Philips Square. Everyone's probably familiar with the site, City Hall and Nathan Philips Square, right in the middle of downtown Toronto. The story actually starts in 1955. There was a proposal prepared at the behest of City Council by a collaborative of a number of established firms in town for a new City Hall and civic building. It was met with a less than enthusiastic response among the citizens and the design community, most notably Professor Eric Arthur at the University of Toronto. So the city decided not to build this. Fear not, the top part of it eventually became the Imperial Oil building up on St. Clair. So in 1956, Toronto City Council voted to undertake an open international competition for the design of a new City Hall at the urging of Mayor Nathan Philips, as well as Eric Arthur and his guys. The competition was launched in 57 and was awarded in 58. The city received 510 entries from 42 countries. At the time, it was the largest international competition of its kind. I don't know if it still is. It maybe still is. I'm not sure, but it was a formidable. The photographs of this room where all the models were laid out is unbelievable. There's a whole set of them in the archives. They're great. The process of building City Hall took 7 years. During that time, the city kept cutting the budget and making adjustments to the design. The lead architect, Villiers Revel, died in that process. But the square opened to great fanfare in 1965, and we have this place that is so amazing and still looks like it's from the future. Fast forward 40 years. Since that grand opening, while the City Hall and the square have aged pretty well, mostly due to the fact that they were built incredibly well, they've also been subject to the pressures of changing demand and uses and maintenance issues and all the things that happen over a long period of time with a civic building. Also, several interventions had taken place over the years that had compromised the integrity of the space. This is the view of the Peace Garden that was added in '83 amid some controversy. So given all of this, the city decided to launch another design competition. So we assembled, well, it's an older team, but it still looks young at this point, a group of colleagues and friends to work on the competition, in addition to Plant, then Short Tilby Irwin, which became Perkins & Will, Toronto, Peter Shout, landscape architect from Chicago, and who's the guy in the Leafs jersey here. He couldn't be there for the team photo. And Adrian Blackwell Urban Project. So that was the kind of core design group for the competition, and became the kind of core design group as we moved forward with the project, which was officially done by a joint venture between ourselves and Perkins & Will. The theme we developed is called AGORA Theatre. The name is derived from the cradle of Western democracy, Athens, whose public life centered on two spaces. The Agora, the public square surrounded by a covered porch or stoa, and the theater, which was the center of civic debate. Revel used democracy as a central metaphor for his design of Toronto City Hall, contrasting the sculptural form of the council chamber, which was pulled out of the building and exposed, in front of the public square. So it set up a dialogue between the people and their elected representatives, and that's a two-way dialogue, right? So there's, awareness on both sides. And it's an incredibly powerful move that he made. The raised walkway and the podium also strongly suggested the potential for the activation of those peripheral spaces. And we really saw it as a place where the theater of public life could kind of flourish again in Toronto. And this project is, for us, really a conversation between contemporary built form and heritage structures, but also picking up on a political conversation that was embedded in that original scheme. So we conceived of Nathan Philips Square as a great urban room opened up in the fabric of the city, acting as a focal point for the public life of Toronto. And there were 4 primary strategies that we drew up to achieve those goals. Opening the square to create a space of pure potential set within an urban forest canopy, programming the perimeter as a porous threshold that is inviting from all approaches, activating the stoa by making the areas on and under the walkways active and appealing spaces to be in, and then bridging the threshold using the architectural elements of the program to make connections both horizontally and vertically. And finally, we wanted a scheme in which the architecture and landscape were tightly integrated so there was no clear spot where one stopped and the other began. So here you can see an overview of the competition scheme that has some updates, so it looks kind of like that now, or at least the pieces that are finished. So you can see there's that forest canopy around the perimeter, a new theater, there's the new Peace Garden over here, the skating rink, and reflecting pool, which is, I think still the best place to skate anywhere. Concession building, a restaurant, the Queen Street forecourt along the front of the sort of front door of the site, and then up on the podium level of City Hall, a new green roof, new park really, that's built on top of the City Hall. And there you can see there's a planned version of the same thing, just for orientation's sake. The first piece to be completed was the podium green roof. The intent was to take a space that had never really been completed. Revell had schemes for it, but they were never executed. And it had been closed for a decade by the time we were brought onto the project, and to kind of recreate it as a new park in the heart of the city. The planting echoes the strong east-west orientation that's already present in the building, with mixed sedums, flowering perennials, grasses, arrayed in a seasonally evolving pattern that flowers from late spring to autumn. There's a series of benches and shade structures that move around the roof, tracking the movements of the sun and providing social spaces, sort of gathering spaces around the roof. We then moved onto the ground and began work on the plaza itself, as well as the elements that surround it. The first is the theater. The theater provides double duty as a stage and an elevated terrace that connects to the walkways above. Below the stage, so in here, there's actually hung an entire floor of new service spaces, dressing rooms, green rooms, AV rooms, stuff like that, that's sort of hung in the space of the parking garage below. Also, the entire project is really a green roof project because it's all built on top of parking. During the day when the stage isn't in use, the dappled shade provided by the fritted glass roof and the space frame structure provides respite from the summer sun. The space frame can support stage services for about 90% of the events that take place on the square. So that covers much of the year. Basically, New Year's Eve and Canada Day are the two events where they build a second stage to have a bigger event. And, the theater provides a space that can be both intimate and charged with, the spirit of rock and roll. Just to the south, a new skate pavilion provides food services, as well as locker and change rooms, public washrooms, and new sports spaces for maintenance, including much needed parking for the Zamboni, which previously was parked behind chain link under the elevated walkways. And then there's an elevated roof terrace on the top that overlooks the square and provides a select vantage point during events. Also quiet spaces in the breezeway and connections to the elevated walkways. To the west of the theater, across the walkways, is the new Peace Garden. This space replaces the 1984 Peace Garden that was placed in the middle of the square and provides both a historical link to the original and a new planted space for contemplation and gathering. The original Peace Pavilion was relocated. That's that guy right there. It was designed by Ken Greenberg, with a new cauldron for the eternal flame below, the flame had been kindled in Hiroshima at the eternal flame there, and it's set within a pool that contains waters from the river in Nagasaki. So there's a view looking back from the pavilion towards City Hall. And I always think, you're doing okay with the project when people want their wedding photos taken there. Just to the north, this is the sundial that was donated by Nathan Philips as a thank you to the citizens of Toronto. It was previously in complete shade inside the old Peace Garden. It's now in one of the few spaces on the square that has no shadows on it. And it sort of leads up into the northwest quadrant, where we've got a new sculpture garden where we sort of collected all of the various pieces of art and other artifacts that had accrued on the square and tried to make a space that organizes them and gives them some sense, as well as restoring these old benches. Hard to see in this picture, but they're huge. They're weirdly scaled. We call them the Star Trek benches because they're like the con on the Enterprise D. And we've now got Winston Churchill facing north. He was previously facing Queen Street. He's now facing north towards the new courthouse that's being built just to the north of there. And then the landscape on the Queen Street forecourt. So this is really the main entry, the front porch of Nathan Philips Square. It's a space that has a massive amount of pedestrian traffic running across it every day. And the landscape that was there before, which is basically grass and a few paths, was completely trampled and mud and awful. So we've now got a new set of materials, hard surface paving, sitting on top of a Silvacell system that supports the paving above a continuous soil volume. So there's soil running underneath all of these pavers, allowing us to plant much more intensely in the planters themselves. And then the planters are ringed by benches and seating areas and things like that. And so for us, ultimately, the success of a project like this is really just how people use it, right? So this is typical daytime, summer lunchtime, people hanging out, eating their sandwiches and texting. The skating rink, of course. This is, for the mechanical engineers in the audience, this is an unsung part of the project. There are lots of these little invisible pieces. During the course of the project, the whole refrigeration system was changed out so that instead of taking 6 weeks every spring and every fall to reconnect the plumbing from fountain to glycol, now they turn a switch and it happens in a day. These are like invisible things that go on a project like this. Nuit Blanche, where generations, young and old, and governors general come together in the pursuit of art and spectacle. The birth and death of stars. The new fountain jets in the middle are a huge hit with kids. As well, with all of the new planting, nature is asserting itself on the square. This guy's part of our pigeon control program. Pillow fights, spontaneous memorials, and then things like New Year's Eve, where basically you can't see the square because of the number of people, but it is a place where people understand that this is their room to use the way that they want. So, the next project is the East Point Park Pavilions. These are park pavilions and a kind of landscape program at the east end of Toronto, over there. That's East Point. East Point Park has been designated a Toronto Bird Sanctuary as part of the Toronto Bird Flyways and Sanctuaries project, due to the large number of migratory birds that use the park as a stopover during migration seasons. It's one of several bird flyway zones. I mean, the most famous of them is probably the Leslie Spit. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard about that. And as a result, birders congregate in this park en masse in the spring and the fall, which created a need for some infrastructure to support them. So this is an overview of the park as a whole. And you've got your softball complex, and then this is the bird sanctuary proper. And then this is the area that we're working within. So the program was essentially to build a shelter for bird watchers, to install a bird blind to allow for better viewing, and some trail signage. This site is interesting along the waterfront because it has this inland pond very close to the lakeshore. And what it means is that there's an opportunity to see different kinds of birds interacting with the different bodies of water. So you get shorebirds and pond birds happening simultaneously. And so, following the theme of conversation, I mean, this is really a conversation between the different kind of views of the lake and the pond. So we developed 2 pavilions. Each addresses one of the water bodies. The architectural form is obviously meant to evoke flight with the kind of, the winged roofs. And again, this is a building that's meant to be sat in and looked out from, right? Again, following that theme of looking at the landscape. So this is a the view of the pondside pavilion. And then this is the lakeside, looking at the lakeside pavilion. And there's also a textual and image-based component in the central walls of the pavilions. So we've got this pattern up here, which you'll see in some of the other photos. It's a representation of a kind of murmuration pattern, which is that crazy thing that starlings do, where they swirl around in the sky, and that provides openness, light, air movement, and visibility through the screens, which is actually like a security concern. We also have the names of all of the birds that inhabit or that use this park, both common and Latin names, of course. And they're also water jet cut out of the screen using a customized stencil typeface that was meant to evoke the type that's typically found on bird bands, like the little things that they put on their ankles. So here's a detail of the bird pattern. This, because of when this project started, which was, I think, 2004, this was essentially hand done. The software that we might have used, something like Grasshopper, it didn't allow us the kind of control we needed for the fabrication process. So Jason Vanderberg in our office spent, I think, 6 months adjusting the birds as each test was made, and we had to kind of balance openness and structural stability and making sure that the corners didn't burn out when the water jet went through it. It was nightmarish, and I think Jason had Hitchcockian nightmares for months after that. But the net result is that you have these pavilions, and they are a kind of delight to look at. And this is looking out at the lake at the end of the day. Here they are next to the pond. You can kind of see their relationship. So that's the one looking out at the lake. And sorry, this is an early shot. There's a bulletin board supposed to go in there. It's not in these shots yet. Sorry. And then looking back at the pond, which is also quite the beautiful spot. And the materiality of them, like using the weathering steel, was also part of a strategy. I mean, part of it is because it's indestructible and it'll last in a public place, but it's also designed to kind of start disappearing into the landscape over time so that it's not jumping out. So also as part of the project, we were able to install a bird blind that we had actually designed and had fabricated about 5 years earlier for a different site. That project didn't finish, so it had been in storage in a city yard waiting for a place to land, and here's where it landed. And you can start to see, like, just between these two, you can see like what starts to happen as the summer comes up and the well, in this case, Phragmites starts to enclose it. This pattern, this laser cut or water jet cutting pattern was designed to evoke tree branches. But it was also partly because we wanted to have wider gaps so that you could get birding glasses, like you could fit birding glasses through them, and at all levels. So kids and adults they all have little slots they can look through. And there's a detail view of that one from the inside. And there it is, sitting deep in the bush, waiting to be engulfed. We also designed trail signage to guide visitors out to the pavilions. And then here you can see it's just slowly disappearing into the landscape. So, next up is Kew Gardens. So, Kew Gardens is a beautiful park out in the Beaches neighborhood of Toronto. Much beloved, quite beautifully designed. And it had a terrible street edge. So this is an aerial that you can see of the park before. The grass basically just came right up to the sidewalk and ended. Obviously lots of foot traffic on there, making it awful. And there was just no kind of subtlety to it. And this is a very heavily used park in that part of the city. And so we were commissioned by the BIA to find a way of making a new address to the park that would also create community space that's out on the street and not just the community space that's in the park itself. So as I said, the existing street edge came right up to the sidewalk, and it had this embankment. You can't see it in here, but there's an embankment that slopes away from the sidewalk, which we were instructed was a vital part of the park at the very, very well attended public meetings. Let me tell you, the Beaches community they're into public process, and it was crucial, and we had to keep it at all costs. So you'll see that comes back. In this case, this project is, it's a way of negotiating a conversation between a historical, picturesque park and a high street condition that has changed dramatically in the, I guess more than a century since the park was built, right? So the Beaches is, it's a very different place than it was back when it was built. So this is a plan, design, I guess it's a design development plan. It's changed a little bit from then, but I mean, essentially what you're seeing here is a set of forms that can accommodate the intense programming that goes on over the course of the year, but still have it look like, it's just a park, right? We saved all of the mature trees that were there and worked around them. We worked with the topography in the layout of the paths and things like that. And then, there's an area in the back here that's this is falling down the hill behind this forecourt area that's actually a kind of dune. It's like a sand dune with beach grasses and things growing on it. So just walking sort of from the west to the east on the site. So that's Queen Street West over there. For the Michael and Dace fans, the R.C. Harris pumping station is down that way. So there's a cenotaph. There was an existing cenotaph at the west end of the park that actually has the largest Remembrance Day ceremony in the city of Toronto, bigger than the one at Old City Hall, which is breathtaking. And before, it all happened on the sidewalk. And so now there's a gathering space around it. There's space behind and a larger forecourt in front of it to accommodate that use. It also now, instead of just addressing the park, there are new inscriptions on the back, and it's sort of addressing instead of just addressing the street, it's now addressing the park. There's an amphitheater just inset from where the cenotaph is that allows for busking and other kinds of performances, and it's kind of pulled into the park to provide a little bit of sound mitigation between the street, but also so any performances don't flood out and disturb the restaurant patrons. There's the new street edge. You can see here that slope was preserved so the kids can roll down it in safety well into the future. I sound like I'm joking, but it is important for things like that. Little kids rolling down hills is great. And then as you walk east, the sidewalk starts to widen out and create a new forecourt. The seating, of course, is also a huge part of animating the space. And, it's still new, so everyone's, really curious about what all of this means. The screen, so we have this big screen that kind of bounds the southern edge of this new forecourt. It's raised like that so that it still allows views through the park. And it's cut with a kind of chinoiserie pattern that's taken from Victorian wallpaper. And it kind of disappears into the trees, especially in the winter. There's a fabrication shot in the shop, so you can see, you can more clearly see what that pattern looks like. And the inscription at the bottom reads, "Kew Gardens, a place for innocent amusement." Joseph Williams, who developed the park at the turn of the last century, wanted to distinguish his park as a place of innocent amusement, in contrast to the dance halls and amusement parks which had gambling that had cropped up along the beach, and he took umbrage at that. You can see the kind of shadows that happen, and then this is a view looking through the screen back to Queen Street. And as well, at night, the screen's lit, so it animates that space and it provides lighting, sort of security lighting, without having to put modesty lights up and things like that. And then the last thing is the paving pattern, which you saw in the other slides. It sort of fades away from the curb down towards the park, and it's really meant to evoke the kind of like the sand and the shifting shore along the lake. So I'm now going to interrupt myself with a brief digression to talk about two other projects that relate to this theme. The first one is an art installation that we did at the Oakville Galleries at the Gairloch Gardens. It's an old Victorian estate that has a part of the gallery in it. It's called Conversation of Views. And it's a project that is really about playing with the existing views on the site and sort of playing with ideas of traditional Victorian gardens and the kind of garden furniture and stuff like that. It consists of a pavilion that you're standing within right now, which frames one of these views. The view is drawn down the length of this long table that at the end has a kind of viewing frame or lucinda at the end of it. It's got a kind of frit pattern on it that makes a kind of foggy view out to the lake. And then behind you, and I didn't bring a slide of it, but there's a view into the kind of planted areas where there's one of two gazing globes that we built out of security mirrors. So the one that you'd be looking at behind you is a 3-foot diameter mirrored sphere that sort of sucks the view down into the woods from the lake. And this project's fundamentally exploring a dialogue with the landscape, but also with the history that's embedded in a place. The second little mini project is an installation we did at the Interior Design Show about 10 years ago. The theme that year was "What Makes You Wealthy?" And our response to that was that what makes you wealthy is sitting at the table with your friends and family over the course of many years, and the kind of history and age that gets built into those tables. So the installation has two parts. One is a dining room that has a 21-foot long dining table in it that's lined with benches. So it's sort of like an old refectory table. The table's quite narrow, and the fact that there are no backs on the benches means that there's no leaning back and getting away from the conversation. When the temperature goes up, you have to lean in and engage. And then there's a forest, a kind of double height space with a forest that's made of chiffon banners with sort of, green and rusty autumn foliage kind of colors. And then during the course of the show, we had a beer tap that was hidden in the woods. So there's a view of the table. The wall behind it was filled with freshly split red oak firewood, which gave the whole room an incredible kind of olfactory component. During the course of the show, there were people who had, this was only up for 3 days, this thing. It was kind of crazy. But there were some people who came in, and the smell made them sit down and start crying because they were having memories of like their grandmother's cantina back home. And it was wild, the things that just like having a material that has a smell in there could do. We set the table with book plates, as we called them. They were discards from the Toronto Public Library of things like music books and atlases and textbooks and stuff like that to kind of set the table. And then we had recorded Thanksgiving dinner the year before, and we piped that, which was at that long table I showed you earlier, and we piped that in as kind of background sound to kind of animate the space. And then on opening night, we had bread, pears, and a big wheel of Parmesan at the end of the table with knives, and then the aforementioned beer, which oddly enough was provided by a brewmaster who we're now doing a brewery for. So these things come back around. But ultimately, the whole installation was about this. So this is opening night. And what was amazing is that, as people were there at the opening and going through all of the other spaces and the other booths and things like that, basically everyone ended up in here, sitting at the table, eating cheese and drinking beer, and the sound was unbelievable because there were like 300 people in that room talking simultaneously. And, the power of that engagement in the social realm is really, like, that's what it's really all about. All right, next. The next project is a piece of public art that is to be installed in a new LRT station in Ottawa. It's part of the part of the sesquicentennial celebrations that are taking place in Ottawa. They're building out the LRT, and so this project is in fabrication and is scheduled to be installed later this year. This is a project that really came from that initial research into the place. The theme of the station is Bytown. That was provided by the client, and so in our initial research, we started, of course, pulling books out of the archives and things and reading a ton of stuff. And we have a real interest in the stories of places and also who tells them and how they're told. So the text we found, some of which is here, that really kind of primed the pump was entitled The Last Days of Bytown by Miss Anne Dewar, published in 1954. It describes in great detail life in Bytown in 1854, just before it became Ottawa a year later. One of the amazing things that we learned from this text is that the Ottawa Historical Society was founded in 1897 by a group of prominent women who realized that somebody had to start taking that place seriously and recording the city and its life for posterity. So they formed the Ottawa Historical Society, which incidentally, in a city of exclusive clubs, did not allow men to join for 100 years. The artwork translates history, in this case, a 6,000-word text about the last days of Bytown before it became Ottawa, written in the 50s by a member of the Historical Society and the women who formed it in 1897 and became keepers of that history. And it's now being reinterpreted in 2017 by, a bunch of architects. The question that we're posing is, what are the stories that we record, tell, and then retell, and why are they important? So these are the ladies. Another complication in this project was finding images of all of these women, which we could then use to create the silhouettes that are part of the art piece. These were all drawn by my partner Lisa from photos at the time and are currently being laser cut out of stainless steel plate. So the name of it is With Words as Their Actions. It's an art memorial to the women who founded the Historical Society. And fundamentally what it is a sort of snaking wall of text. It's a screen with text, English and French. So we translated it, or had it translated into French. And the texts are running, they're interwoven, and they're running in opposite directions. So you read the English from one side and the French from the other side. And collectively, they provide the degree of openness that's needed for security and airflow and all of those kinds of things. And then the lady heads sort of snake around on the top of it. And I think this next image is too big because it takes forever to load. So that's a kind of model view of it, sort of running back and forth. This is on the mezzanine level. It's not where the trains come in, but it's the level up. And then beach ball. So this is one of the fabrication drawings. So you can see here. So With Words as Their Actions comes from a statement that's in the book. These women built Bytown and Ottawa with words as their actions, and that became the kind of theme for the project. So you'll have this long text running through the station. We realized that nobody's likely to sit or stand there and read 6,000 words while they're waiting for their train. So we've incorporated bookmarks, little tabs that stick out. Here's a rendering of what that would look like. They're kind of like medieval illuminated letters that start the paragraph, so that you can, where you left off the previous day, and you can keep reading the next time you're there. And then that's an example of, this is a mock-up or a sample of the text panel, showing that this is something we sort of thought it would be a crazy thing to try, but it actually works incredibly well, having the text running in the opposite direction, because somehow your eye manages to ignore the letters that are backwards. So you can read the text in one direction and not get distracted by the other one. Okay, so the last project I want to discuss is probably the smallest space we have designed. It's a project that's called Lenticular Curtain. It was part of an exhibit at the sadly now defunct Architecture Gallery at Harbourfront. The title of the show is Breathtaking. And it was meant to be an exploration of the dialogue between architecture and landscape. So this project exemplifies the way in which an open-ended process can lead you to unexpected places. And honestly, it's sometimes scary to work this way, not knowing where you're going to end up, but it's exhilarating too. So the curatorial question was, how can architecture create an awe-inspiring experience through the placement of a built form within the landscape? The question we asked ourselves was, how can we make a piece of landscape that is architecture? So we began with a piece of quintessential Canadian landscape, a forest on an island in Georgian Bay, which we documented photographically. These are some early sketches. We wanted to see if there was a way of deconstructing a set of images of a forest that would let us bring not just the image of the forest, but the experience of the forest into a gallery setting. We started to explore the idea of lenticular images. Those are I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but it's like those postcards where you go like this, and the Pope raises his hand when you move it from side to side. But it basically consists of breaking up an image into two sets of strips and looking at them differently. And then also looking at bead curtains, which are a way of making a solid that you can pass through. So this kind of sketching turned into this, which is probably one of the most insane drawings that we've ever generated. It was done by our associate Lisa Dietrich in our studio, laying out the precise location of hundreds of strips of photos. It's hard to see on the slide, but they all have little code numbers and things attached to them. We then sliced up the photos, made strips and numbered them all, tagged and bundled them, and then began the assembly. So this is, some of the crew starting to set it up. And this was the finished product in the gallery, a cube of forest in downtown Toronto. There's a detail of the bottom, which has individually zip-tied on little washers to keep it hanging straight. And the experience of this thing is very hard to describe with slides like this, but the effect of the image being cut into strips was that it became hard to focus on the image itself, and it started to get that effect that you have when you're looking at a forest that's really dense, like dense underbrush and stuff like that, where you can't quite focus on one part of it. And so what you got was a sense of the forest being there, but without actually being able to see the image clearly. And then when people walked into it, they had an expectation, of course, of walking into a forest from which they would then emerge. However, what they found inside was a view of the ocean off of Peggy's Cove. So what should have been an even more enclosed, more intimate space in the forest instead was one of infinite horizon on the inside. We had basically inverted the landscape. And I got to tell you, it was great sitting in the gallery and listening to people's reactions when they walked in there, because people would regularly kind of squeal with delight or go, gasping. We'd also made a seat in there that's a log wrapped in canvas. And when you sat on it, your eyes more or less aligned with the horizon. And one of the other byproducts of this kind of sliced up lenticular image is that people, when they were aligned with the horizon, would come out and say that they had to get out because they were feeling vertigo. Like it was having a kind of infinite depth effect on people when they sat in there, because they weren't able to focus on one part of the image. And then there's a detail. There was actually a column in the middle of it that we had to kind of hide. And then it traveled down to Austin, Texas, as part of an exhibit at the architecture school called Curtains, which is appropriate, I guess. And again, people's responses were amazing. Some people were afraid to go in. They would stand there and kind of look in. And then at night, the seaside basically illuminated the forest from within, and you had this kind of beautiful glowing cube. So what I'll leave you with is this. We've found that for us, being willing to engage in an open-ended process of investigation, research, discussion, argument, and design can take you places you never expected and create delight in the process. And isn't that why we're designers in the first place? Thanks. Questions? I don't feel awkward.
In the opening slide, you talked about sort of the overall 1, 2, 3 process in terms of how you like to work. But do you find that there's cheating that goes on that you want to jump ahead? Let's do design. We'll do research later.
Of course. I mean, that slide, which is, I can sort of, let me pull that up, because it is kind of fun to look at. I mean, this is a kind of idealized set of components of the process. And I like to think that most of them anyway happen for every project, not necessarily in this order, but I think that, one of the things, when we started our practice, one of the things that we said was, look, like we've all worked in other offices and whatever, some fantastic and some less fantastic. And what we wanted to make sure that we were able to do was to do stupid, crazy things every so often, even if they were, like a heck of a way to run a choo-choo. You're not making money on it, but I think, this maybe comes back to Waterloo and Waterloo in the 80s and, the kind of, the concentration on the text, the concentration on research. We're interested in that. We geek out on reading arcana about some place that we're going to do a project. And, I think, like I used to joke that I'm the guy who still walks down the street and picks up the pebble, like a 5-year-old. And I think if you can't find those moments of delight in the world, you're missing out on so much. And so we try and bring that into the work we do. So even when we're doing, we do all sorts of crazy little, or not crazy little projects, washroom pavilions and, eye wash stations. We actually did an eye wash station for the town of Oakville that had the first green roof that they ever did on a civic building. And it was 20 square feet, I think. It was a little eye wash station built on the edge of an arena. It had a green roof on it. So, there's a way of working something fun into any project you work on. And yeah, sometimes, the order gets jumbled a little bit, but, we try not to cheat too much. Any other questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
The screens you've developed for your projects are quite beautiful, and I really love the work you're doing with them. Just wondering, how do you, in the process, create any mock-ups or illustrations, or how do you sort of develop the design from concept through to final iteration, which presumably is quite
like you're talking about like the laser cut
Yes.
and water jet cut
Yeah.
screens in the various projects. It depends. So I've done a lot of signage over the years, and so some of that is brought to bear. One of the things we've found, so some things are fairly straightforward, like the project in Ottawa it's basically text layout. And, I was asked a question earlier today, have we ever done our own typefaces and things like that? We do play around, and on Kew Gardens, that typeface, I actually customized all the letters myself to make them into stencils. It's not actually a stencil typeface. But we also work with a typographer in Toronto, Richard Hunt, who will, we're working on that project, like the lion thing, and he did a custom typeface for us based on another typeface that allowed us to laser cut it and to make the pylons are the things that connect. Not pylons, bridges, are the things that connect the counters of letters that where they'd otherwise knock out, and we'd had to increase the width of them so that the stainless steel, you couldn't snap it off and that kind of stuff. And so technologically, we start by working in InDesign because you can flow text really quickly. That goes into Illustrator where you can work with the letter forms more closely. And then that usually gets translated into some CAD drawing, either DXF or DWG or something that the cutting machines can use. And it's an iterative process. We do a layout, they do a sample, it comes back, there's a problem here, this is too thin, revise it, send it back, do another, and it's back and forth. Something like that bird screen, now we would probably be able to do it with software, right? There was some software help. Jason actually used, in Illustrator, there's a function, I don't want to go too nerdy down this rabbit hole, but there's a function where you can use this kind of symbol painter and keep spacing between things. But ultimately, yeah, we had to do it manually. Now you could probably write a script that would allow you to get that kind of pattern without too much handwork. So it's something like that. It just is constantly evolving as the software evolves, right? I don't know if that answers all the question, but.
Chris, first, thanks very much for the presentation tonight. I think those of us in the room that are associated with the professions, architecture, urban design, landscape architecture, would agree that the breadth of the work that you've shown us in this small snapshot of your commissions is really intriguing. And I want to come back to the first project that you presented and kind of the opposite of the idea that an open-ended project is kind of unnerving. On an 85-acre project, although it's not a blank canvas with the likes of the manicured landscape and gorges and the like, similar to the blank canvas, what is that first stroke and how do you get there?
Well, I mean, I think I think I talked a little bit about that. I think for us, and this is whatever, more than 20 years ago. So we were younger and more naive then, right? So maybe we weren't afraid of something like that then. But I think in that case in particular, there was a combination of the clients who were incredibly open-minded, and I mean, obviously they have some resources, so that's nice. But they were not afraid to not know where it was going. Right? Very often a client will start a project and they'll say, what's it going to look like? And we will often answer, we have no idea, because you don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe you have some sense of it, but in that case, we didn't know where it was going to go. And I think in that project in particular, because there was this kind of epiphany of, like after having spent weeks over the course of the summer walking around the site on a regular basis and trying to get to know it, that realization that learning process could be turned into the project was it basically set, like the canvas wasn't actually blank. The canvas was fully written on, and we were just adding little pieces here and there that let you look at it in more detail, right? So that one was kind of easy. I don't know, is that a fair answer?
I think the important point is that it might have been some naivete, but don't be afraid to take that first step on the first stroke.
Well, and I think something that of course, over time as you do more work and like you get more confident and things like that. But I think something that we try to embrace is to do projects that we don't know how to do. Right? Like that's often runs counter to what, well, certainly, like the RFP process doesn't want people who haven't done one of those or 10 of those before. But, from a kind of design perspective, doing a project that you've never, like a kind of project you've never done is the best kind, because you're just constantly learning, right? And whatever, you bring experts on board so you make sure that you don't completely cock it up. But yeah, that's the most fun. It was actually, I should say, extemporizing like crazy. The Eameses, Charles and Ray Eames, were famous for this. You'd go into their studio, and there'd be someone who was a film editor with 20 years of experience, and they were over in the corner building a piece of furniture. And the cabinet maker was doing a set of architectural drawings, and the architect was working on a film. Because what they wanted is they wanted the other side of people's brains to be brought to the process. And I mean, obviously they were curating and everything else, but like that is a way of working that is just so inspiring. And you look at what they achieved, it's incredible, right? So don't be afraid, people. Yeah, or be very afraid. Both at the same time. It's a conversation between fear and confidence. That's it? No one wants to know what all the typefaces were?
Well, stay here.
I'll stay here. Sit for a second.
Yeah, have another drink of water. I want to thank Chris on behalf of the London Society of Architects and Museum London, and also thank people for coming out today. I think this was a different kind of a conversation talk. It wasn't meant to be a lecture, I don't think, although there was some advice given at the end. Don't be afraid. But I knew that Chris would be a great addition, and I've had the good fortune of working with Chris and his colleagues, and it is a different way of working. It's certainly a different way of working that I'm used to, and I think what was nice to see that you didn't see
typically is lots of renderings and computer graphics and it was kind of fun today to come down to the lecture theater today and see a life drawing class going on out in the gallery space. And this is kind of like a nice little meshing that was going on here. So again, I want to thank you very much for treating us to tonight's talk.
Great pleasure.